Education.
Therapeutic.
Say it again.
Therapeutic.
Therapy.
Calming.
Calm.
Hydration.
Hydration.
Defy gravity.
Defi-
Defying gravity.
Ooh, that's some alphabet stuff right there. Good job. That's cool. I like that. Anything else?
I just pretended I was.
Obviously, elephant in the room work for all of us. Career. I like that better than work. It's a fancier word. Here's a seat up here, Ryan, behind Ivan, or right next to Ivan, in front of me. All right, so the reason I wanted you all to think about that, morning, David, is because for me, and the reason why I wanted to do this presentation is water makes up my entire life. You know, it is all of my hobbies revolve around the water. My work revolves around the water. I have 3 jobs teaching 4 different water sports. And I volunteer my time with 3 different organizations that use water as a therapeutic medium. Therapy, like Lydia, therapeutic medium to help transform people. Mostly it's overcoming addiction, helping children with autism kind of have like a normal, fulfilling day, and a lot of work with veterans and first responders as well. So some people love the water, some people hate the water. I both love it, hate it, fear it, respect it, cherish it. I curse it all the time, but I'm also like, it's the best thing ever, you should try it. It ruined my life. So, this presentation is mostly me trying to go, you know, why do I feel this way about water? When I started noticing kind of thing after thing, and just noticing I kept getting drawn and pulled further into the water, metaphorically speaking. I started to wonder, like, is there science behind the reason I feel this way? You know, is there, and I've noticed it when I talk to other people, everybody has like a really cool water story to tell, or everybody's like so stoked in the water. And so I started to wonder, like, is there a reason we all kind of feel this way? Is there a reason for that? So I found that there's way more research on it than I kind of thought there would be. And the easiest way to break it up is into these 3 different questions. What happens to our bodies when we swim? What happens to our brains when we swim? And ultimately, why do we swim? So first, we will begin with the question, what happens to our bodies? Now, the structure of the human body is the legacy of the ancient fish. When you look at a human fetus, the cells that are used to grow our limbs are the exact same cells that are used to grow the fins of fish. Additionally, when you look at like a human fetus, embryo, zygote thing, whatever it is at this stage in its life, so that up the top is like where the head would be. And these right here are gill slits. And those gill slits, we actually practice breathing in and out of, and that's what form the muscles and the rest of our respiratory tracts as we continue to grow and mature in the womb. You can see here, ultimately it ends up as part of our jaws, our ears, some of our throats, all that. But it's so cool. I tell all of the parents in my parent talk classes, I'm like, did you know your baby had gills and they were growing and they were breathing in and out of their gills while they were in your body? And they were like, what? So one of the, you know that thing that dogs do when you like hold them over the bathtub and then they start just like doing this? Newborns will do that for a period of time. It's a pretty short window, but newborns will do that. I was giving this presentation yesterday to our managers, and Jacob was like, Molly does that. She'll just go and they kind of like wiggle and stroke like this. So you could also tell that to your parents, and they're like, what? It's really cool. In fact, seawater is so similar in mineral content to our own blood that our white blood cells can live and survive in it for like, I think it's like a number of days. So pretty incredible. Furthermore, further research that we came out of this world, not into it. We are of the planet, if you want to get real hippy-dippy with it. So, all right, so we're actually born with some genetic traits. One of them we use here all the time at Watersafe Swim School, especially with newborns. Anybody want to shout out what they think it is? It's on the board. What is it?
Mammalian dive reflex.
Mammalian dive reflex. Thank you. You're all Oh, so smart. So the mammalian dive reflex is what is genetically encoded into every single human being on the planet. Every person just born with it. We don't have to do anything. It's there. It's the exact same reflex that marine mammals all have as well. They just have it at maybe higher thresholds. So the fun thing about the mammalian dive reflex, though, is that it takes about 5 minutes for it to take full effect. So I don't know if any of y'all have ever noticed, but your kids kind of suck at like holding their breath, moving fluidly through the water, and generally just being calm, cool, collected swimmers. That's partly because the mammalian dive reflex doesn't kick in for about 5 minutes. So let's start with what we know and use all the time at Watersafe, which is breath holding. So we have this nerve up and around our face. It's kind of around our eyes, our nose, upper lip of our mouth, all that. That's called the vagus nerve. And when water hits that, we instantaneously have the reflex to hold our breath. But we're all born with it, right? But newborns, as they grow and mature, and as their neurological systems start to develop, it's gonna override that reflex. And that's why it goes away after between 4 to 6 months. So it's a reflex that needs to be exercised in order to become a conditioned response. There's actually like some discourse in the scientific world right now about this, saying that, are they going to rename it the mammalian dive response, actually, because it's technically, if it doesn't last forever and it has to be conditioned, technically it should be called a response, not a reflex, but that's not my territory, so it's a reflex. The cool thing about this reflex, though, is that the more we practice, the stronger and the quicker it gets. So the more kids come to our lessons and the more they're practicing, the closer and closer, the less and less time it's going to take for them to like become cool, calm in the water. They're going to start to nail their lessons within the first couple minutes instead of having to get halfway through and then we go like, oh, now you're the good swimmer, I know you are. All right, so we're going to move on to the second part of the mammalian dive reflex, which is what's called bradycardia. Bradycardia is just a fancy medical term for a drop in heart rate. As soon as our face hits the water, our heart rate's going to drop by 10 to 25% instantaneously. And within the first 30 seconds of being submerged, we can actually go from a very high heart rate to a resting heart rate. So superhuman power. I actually use this all the time before I go into like scary situations, such as like Costco on the weekend, or like family gatherings, or like before I came here and did all this with you guys, I sat in my car with my dive mask on and filled it up with water, and I did this like nice breathing exercise that we do. And I'll like do this or two when I like get in a fight with my boyfriend, and then I'll like go sit in my car and need some space, and he'll come out and be like, "Are you okay?" I'm like, "Do I look okay?" I got a mask of water in the car, and I'm going. So, fun fact. But how can we use this in our lessons? How can we use the bradycardic response in our lessons with our kids, particularly if they're screaming, dysregulated, all of that? Does anybody have any ideas?
Just drop them.
Just drop them. Deep breaths. It's kind of hard. Yes, theoretically, yes, but it could be kind of hard. 1, 2, they're in that dysregulated state. It's hard to tell them, well, breathe, you know. As adults, we're better hearing that because we know it works, but if you're a kid and they're like, just breathe, they'd be like, what? You're not listening. So what I'll do is, mind you, this is with a child who has already been coming to lessons and they've mastered grade 1. And many of our kids still continue to scream and cry after then. I'll get 2 castles that are pretty close together, and I'll grab them on one, and 1, 2, 3, we dive in, swim to the other one. It's easy, short, it's usually like 3 seconds long or so. And then I'll grab them, they get to take 1 or 2 breaths up, and I grab them and go again. Take 1 or 2 breaths, grab and go again. And we do that for at least 5 minutes. Why? So the mammalian dive reflex can totally kick in. And what I'm doing is I'm putting their body through a physical response, and it's helping them to undergo an emotional response, right? I'm helping them regulate their breathing. I'm letting their face stay under the water for long enough that the mammalian dive reflex can start to have its effect, and their heart rate's going to come down. And because of that, because they're underwater, yes, they're going to end up taking deeper breaths. Yes. So it's easier to do that than to tell like a 1-year-old, like, just breathe. So mind you, that is with a child, again, who already has good breath control, already has passed their grade 1. It's easy for them. You're not going to be overwhelming them just because you're shoving them under the water constantly. Okay. It's done with love. It's not out of hate. Oh, I've noticed when I do this, I don't know if like on my Thursday nights, those of you who know I have like Ryan, I did this with Ryan, and after 2 lessons of this, that's when she started being like totally chill. On my Wednesdays, Jack, the little blondie that's like psycho, I did it with Jack, if any of y'all know him, and then he's just like loved the water ever since. So if you have someone who's just like screaming, you can't get anything done with them, try this for like 2 lessons, 3 lessons. For me, it's worked every single time. So hope that helps.
So they pop up. Okay, we're going back.
Yep. Yep. Yeah. Jenny, you used to teach Bodhi. I did this with Bodhi, and then that's how he kind of initially stopped his whole scream cycle.
Oh, that's great. I felt like it was a failure with him.
Yeah. So and now he's amazing. He's amazing.
That's awesome.
All right. Blood shift is the third thing that happens. To our body. So what happens is because the pressure outside in the water is greater than the pressure inside our body, it tends to force all the blood away from our extremities and towards the important things, our heart, our lungs, our brain. Also, the mammalian dive reflex naturally just kind of tries to pull it in to conserve heat and to conserve energy. But what this does is now there's extra blood volume in and around your abdomen. And your heart actually has to move that extra blood volume around. So it actually increases your circulation by 30%. And just as a result of that, that gives swimming a whole host of health benefits that other sports just simply can't match because it just increases the circulation. Your blood volume has to increase. And because of that, your arteries also have to open up in order to let that blood flow through, correct? So that happens when they open up like that, they release a hormone known as catecholamine. And catecholamine, when they've done studies on this with people swimming or with people who are meditating, the catecholamine is altered in the exact same way in both scenarios. So this means that physically speaking, you don't have to meditate to take advantage of its health effects. You don't have to meditate to reach a meditative state within your body. You just go swimming and water does all the work for you. Pretty amazing, in my opinion. It's also because we have all this extra blood in our abdomen and chest area, it compresses on our bladder, and that's what makes us have to pee all the time when we're in the water. And also it produces the wrinkles on our hands and feet. So obviously all of our blood is getting pulled away, so our hands and feet get kind of wrinkly and dehydrated. But they're also finding that this is probably less of just a result of the blood pulling away and more a result of that our bodies have had to learn how to do this, because when they get the wrinkles on them, it increases our ability to identify texture underwater and our ability to grip things underwater. All right.
Wow.
And the final, and in my opinion, the coolest, most superhuman phenomenon is, we use this one, and when I do my freediving class all the time, is what's known as spleen contraction. So the spleen is a reservoir for red blood cells. Red blood cells are what carry oxygen around your body to your different muscles and your brain, your lungs, all of that. So marine mammals have disproportionately large spleens, and the reason for this, they're finding, is because when we immerse underwater, what happens to our spleen is our spleen contracts and then poofs out all of these red blood cells to the rest of our body. And that term, poofs out, is actually a scientific term. The text that I read this in, that I found this in, it literally said the spleen poofs out. So that's not a silly word I made up, that's the scientific term. And why would we want more red blood cells to the rest of our body? More oxygen, yes, thank you. And they're finding they're doing studies with Olympic athletes who are synthetically getting red blood cells pumped into them, and then another group of Olympic athletes who are just holding their breath using the mammalian dive reflex, and they're finding that there's no difference in their performance. So you could get your own extra red blood cells naturally, or you can pump them into yourself, whichever way you want to go. So this is the genetic code that's written into all of us and that we all possess. But there's actually some of us who get lucky enough to have a couple extra genetic things, just I guess written in our DNA, like given to us. So there's one acquired trait as well. So first, genetically, they're finding that there's a few colonies that are still very nomadic. You know, they're still very, very reliant on the sea. They don't, like, I said, oh, water's my whole life. Like, it quite literally is not their whole life and their entire village's life, their entire civilization's lives. And what they're finding in these studies is that those civilizations of people who are totally reliant on the sea, their spleens are 50% larger than anybody nearby on related mainland or elsewhere other related areas. They're also finding, those people, they can dive, because they have larger spleens like that, they can dive down 200 feet and stay there for 10 minutes at a time, which is like the longest free dive in general is 24 minutes, but that's without moving at all. So, and they typically say that the 1/4 of your entire time that you can hold your breath without moving, you can do about 1/4 of that while moving. So they still surpass anything that any of us can naturally do. There's also some people, this is less reliant on where you live and more just like the luck of the draw. Some people have a thicker wall of body fat. It's like 14 millimeters thick on average. When it's thicker, it's about 14 millimeters thick, which is 2 to 3 times thicker than anybody else has. And what this does is it actually makes their skin composition closer to that of a seal instead of as like a human skin. So these people typically have better buoyancy. They can stay, they expend less energy in the water. They stay warmer longer. Pretty cool. And there's one other thing that actually everybody can get, and you have to do it. It's called early immersion training. Luckily, we do it here at Watersafe all the time. We have to get it. It's with kids who start swimming at 2 years old or younger. And if we start swimming them without goggles and they're opening their eyes underwater, their pupils will actually learn to constrict underwater so they can see the finer detail in things underwater. But you have to be doing it before they're 2 years old. They can improve their sight up until they're about 6, but it won't ever be as sharp as it can possibly get if they don't start before they're 2. And it happens in as little as 12 exposures. So just think like 12 lessons of getting someone at a lesson without goggles, and boom, they already have better vision than you and I probably have. Underwater. All right, so if our bodies contain all of these features to help make us better adapted for the water, it got me begging the question, like, does our brain also have some features like this? It kind of must, it has to. So when I initially started asking this question, what happens to our brains when we swim, I didn't realize how big of a question I was asking and how many different disciplines it was going to have to pull from in order to get the information. So we're going to go through kind of a pathway of 3 separate questions. This part of the presentation itself could be 3 hours long. So I'm just going to like spit facts at you and you have to just accept them as true. There's so many cool studies that like go into all this, and I wish I could tell you about them because it's like so fascinating the way that they found these things out. But we just don't have the time, so I'm just going to say this is fact, this is fact, this is fact. Moving on. I promise it's true. I can give you the books if you want to fact check me, whatever. All right, so first we'll start with how does our brain react to water, and move to why does our brain react this way to water, and finally we'll end up with how does the brain learn to swim, something that we all have to understand here as teachers. So first, how does our brain react to water? Well, our brains are actually hardwired to react positively to water. So it's already known that nature and natural settings have a positive effect on us, right? If we're stressed out, if we aren't feeling so good, get out in nature, and boom, suddenly people are like going up for a stupid walk for my stupid mental health, right? That's what that is nature has good effects on us. But what they're finding is that water in and of itself, it doesn't matter what the setting is. If water's present, it's gonna give you that effect anyways. So they've done studies here where like there's an urban setting with water in it, there's a greenery setting, and then a greenery setting with water in it, right? And what they're finding is that people are gonna higher rate this one, the urban setting with water in it, higher than they rate the greenery setting, just because there's water there. They're gonna say that, oh, that one made me feel happier, that one made me feel more restorative, that one made me feel in a better mood, right? They're also finding that students in their dorm rooms, when they split them into 3 different groups. So students whose dorm rooms looked out into something like an urban setting, and then students whose dorm rooms looked out and saw like maybe a park, and then a third group of students whose dorm rooms looked out and saw like a park with a lake in it, right? And the students whose dorm rooms looked out and saw a park and a lake, any kind of water feature present, performed better on tests with their attention, with their focus, with their cognitive abilities, better than all of the other groups combined. So if you're going through school, you need to study, you have a kid who needs to study, put water around them somewhere, somehow, and they're gonna better understand, they're gonna better take in the information, they're gonna have better attention, better focus. Okay, moving on. Our hospital patients are found to need less pain medication if like they're sitting in their hospital bed, there's a picture of water at the foot of their bed. They're just gonna need less pain medication overall throughout the entire course of their treatment. Being near the water adds about 5% to a person's level of happiness. Now, happiness is a weird thing to kind of study because it's so interdimensional, but the difference in 5% of happiness is the difference between going to a show or exhibition and doing house chores. So just because you're closer to the water means you're gonna add automatically about 5% to your relative mood and rate of happiness with the thing you're doing currently. And lastly, they're finding that vacations to coastal areas, somebody said vacation earlier when they said that's what water plays in their life. Vacations to coastal areas give people greater recalled feelings of happiness, restoration, and fulfillment across every single demographic, age, race, income level, it did not matter. Everybody's gonna feel more fulfilled because they went on a vacation near water. I know I do this all the time. I'm like, I live at the beach, and every time I go on vacation, it's to another beach. So this is like such a well-known fact that when you look through like travel magazines, they'll allocate as much as half of their pages to destinations that involve water in them. It's kind of fun. I'm doing it on airplanes now, and I just count all the pages with water on them, and like it's once you see it, it's so obvious. You're like, come on. All right, so of all the studies done on happiness, relaxation, and cognitive function, water provides the most profound shortcut. So next we have to ask, well, why does our brain react this way to water? And the answer to that lies in the brain's function to us as developing humans. So from an evolutionary standpoint, the brain evolved to solve problems related to surviving in an unstable outdoor environment, and to do so in nearly constant motion. That's a lot of work for the brain to do, and I'm sure we all know, we don't like to do a lot of work. The brain does not like to do a lot of work. What this means is the brain focuses on what it deems important. This is usually just 1 to 2 things. Our brain is not good at multitasking. It stresses out when it has to do that, so it focuses on 1 to 2 things. Interprets what that information means based on its prior experience, and then predicts the consequences of those 1 to 2 things it picked out. Ultimately, this boils down to pattern recognition and prediction. This is something we all kind of know about ourselves, like identify a pattern and predict what's going to happen. But this is actually what your brain is hardwired to do. So over time, as people were evolving, we found that it was safer and easier for us to settle closer to the water. Oftentimes we could see better if predators or enemies were approaching us from across the water. Large land-based predators didn't really come out of the water, and large marine predators couldn't really exit the water and still live or pose a great threat to us. So overall, we weren't running for our lives every single second when we were near the water. In addition, we didn't have to run around and forage around for stuff. We could go to the water's edge and see what was brought to us that day. So we were able to settle. Over 3 million years of evolution, the water just steadily patterned our brain to associate safety, tranquility, and abundance with it. They're finding that in some study, or there's a few studies where people have to watch like all these videos, and while the people are watching videos with water in them, their cognitive engagement significantly drops, which shows us that water offers us a sort of mental rest period. Evolutionarily speaking, this means that we don't have to fear for our lives every single second. When water's present, we feel safe, we feel like we can kind of tone it down and dial it back. Being around the water provides a sensory-rich environment with enough soft fascination to let our focused attention rest and the default mode network kick in. We're going to come back to that, the default mode network. Try to keep that little phrase in your brain. So going back to remember when I talked about catecholamine and making our arteries puff up, making our arteries expand and mimicking the effects of meditation. So not only does our body mimic meditation, our brain also mimics meditation when we are around the water. You don't have to meditate. Water meditates you. So all of these positive effects just by looking at the water, just by being around the water, we have all these positive effects. But when you get your face in it and you get under the water, all of these effects that we just learned about, they magnify exponentially. They can't be matched. There's nothing else they've found that gets anybody close to these. But in order to do that, you have to know how to swim and not just stay alive in the water, be reasonably at ease within it. So the next part is this is a funny quote I came across while I was reading one of the texts. Every swim teacher is eager to claim that the water and swimming are great fun. I think they are lying. So I just thought this was like, or I was like, geez, don't yell so loud at me when I read it in the book. We can think about what goes into learning how to swim, or just what goes into swimming in general. You know, we go underwater and the water gets into our ears, which in and of itself is a pretty uncomfortable feeling. Not to mention you can't hear very much, or your hearing's disturbed. It doesn't taste very good, especially chlorine and salt. If it gets up your nose, it stings, and there's no real quick way to fix it. Yes, you can blow it out your nose, but it still is going to continue to kind of sit up there and sting for a good period of time. If it gets into your mouth and you accidentally breathe it in, you feel like you're going to die. You know, I do this all the time on accident. I tell my kids, I'm like, oh, I did that just like 5 minutes before your lesson. Like, it is so uncomfortable, and we all are just like, when we come out. Pools, lakes, oceans, most places, we're lucky here to have a nice warm pool, but most places where water is present, the water's pretty cold, and people say it turns you blue. Which, like, I'm the one, I'll turn purple like instantly. Also, chlorine and salts on our eyes. I mean, if you have water without either one of those two things, you open your eyes and it kind of makes your eyes a little itchy. If you add chlorine and salt to that, it just makes it way more uncomfortable. So ultimately, learning how to swim is freaking hard. There's so much input into our brains. And remember, we just learned our brains hate that much input. It hates that. But when we go underwater, all these things happen all at the same time. We can't just pick one thing out or another. And what that does is it causes immense stress and huge amounts of anxiety for our brain. But at the same time, our brain, through 3 million years of evolution, has been patterned to associate water with being safe, with being tranquil, with being relaxing and boosting our mood. So how many of us have kids who are still screaming and crying with us, but their parents are like, oh my God, they love swim days. They're always asking me about when they swim, right? That's why they're doing that. They have this dichotomy in their bodies and in their brains. They want to be good at it. They want to like it, but it just sucks for them right now. So the two major neurological processes at play when we're trying to fight this kind of dichotomy, and specifically with swimming, are zoning and drifting. So first we'll start with zoning. Zoning, I'm sure we've all kind of seen this diagram or a similar diagram around. Zoning in the brain is, okay, so first we'll start with our comfort zone. Comfort zone we call type 1 fun. It's things that are easy, they're not challenging, you don't have to think about them. Watching TV, have like a nice walk around the neighborhood or whatever. Zone 2 or type 2 fun is our stretch zone. These are things that are not necessarily fun while you're doing them, but when you kind of finish, you go, oh, that was so great, right? Like a hike, a really hard, strenuous hike. You're like, oh, this sucks, why do I do this? I hate this. And then you get to the top and you're like, oh my gosh, I love doing this, right? A lot of like sailors or ocean people, I like myself included, it's like the ocean will like pummel you and hit you and all that, and you're like, oh my god, I hate this place, and then you get like one wave. Or as soon as sailors like hit land again after a storm, they're like, I love sailing. So that's type 2 fun. Type 3, which is not fun, is your panic zone. And the big important thing to remember about the panic zone, you're full of stress, anxiety, fear, is that you don't learn in your panic zone. Nothing about that brought any kind of positive learning to you. It was all just horrible, terrible, horrible, no good, very bad. I forgot to include it, but outside the panic zone, you die. So the panic zone is the step right before that. So you can imagine, like, there is absolutely no fun having. Your brain learns nothing from it. It's too overwhelmed. It's too stressed out. It can't perform any of its functions. So, and swimming, for example, when we kind of think about these zones in terms of swimming, when you are in your comfort zone, okay, let's say like a grade 4 student, what would be something that should be in their comfort zone? Yell it out. Castle swims, cool. Anything else? Floating, yep, should be in their comfort zone by then.
Going underwater just to look.
Going underwater just to look and kind of, yeah, good one. All right, so when you are in your comfort zone in the water, you are swimming, okay? When you're in your panic zone in the water, you are drowning. When you need to be relaxed in order to swim. How many of us have kids who can like back float with their legs crossed and their arms in the air? Right? I know David has one. He tells me about it all the time. Okay? That's because they're relaxed. It doesn't matter what position they're in, they're relaxed, right? Most kids will get a float nice like this. So let's say we have a grade 2 student, right? We're working on back floats with them. That's in their stretch zone. They need to still be calm in their stretch zone. They need to still have, remember we said the brain doesn't like to focus on a lot of things at once. It wants 1 or 2 pieces of information maximum. So when they're floating and they're going, and how many of us go, I hear myself do it all the time, I'm like, just relax, it'll be fine, right? If you felt like you were barely staying above the water and could barely, would you be relaxed? No, you'd be in your panic zone, you would not be learning, you would not be listening, right? So, when we're doing this, because zoning in the brain, because with positive experiences the zones grow, and with negative experiences the zones shrink, we have to be giving our kids way more success than they ever have failures. And that's what's so awesome about our teaching aids, is that it takes the stretch zone, which would normally be this big, and it makes the stretch zone way greater. You know, we could technically practice rollover swims halfway across the pool with a grade 2 student, and they could be calm and at ease there, right? We don't do it because it's just like so far away, and there's other things we should be focusing on, but we could, and that would reasonably be within the stretch zone. One thing to remember about this, your brain can move in between these zones because of neuroplasticity. I'm sure some of us kind of already know the term, but neuroplasticity is what's responsible for learning. Yes. Neuroplasticity is what it helps us form memories, it helps us learn, it helps these zones to grow and to shrink. So a good experiment that was used to kind of show you how, if you use these zones correctly or incorrectly, was the Yerke-Dotson law. The Yerke-Dotson law, what they did is they took these 3 different groups of Japanese dancing mice. When I tell this story, I always picture them with top hats and little tap shoes on. But that's just the kind of mice that were used. And for lack of a better term, or what they said, is they tortured these 3 groups of mice at different levels. So the first group, they kept in the comfort zone. They just let them be mice. They didn't give them any kind of torture, no kind of other stimuli or anything. The second group of mice, they put in the stretch zone. So they tortured them a mild amount. I don't know what a mild amount of torture is for a mouse, but we'll just encompassly say a mild amount of torture. And then the third group of mice, they put into their panic zone. They gave them a whole bunch of torture. Sad to think about, but that is what they did. And what they found is that they had each of these mice try to run a maze after X amount of time that they'd been torturing them at the various levels. With the first group of mice that were left in their comfort zone and weren't exposed to torture, they found that they were unmotivated to run the maze, and they didn't learn anything from not being tortured, so they couldn't really function through the maze at all. With the third group of mice that they tortured a lot, they found that those mice were traumatized and too scared. They were completely shut down. They didn't want to run the maze. Not only that, but they didn't learn anything from their massive amounts of exposure to torture, and they just could not run the maze. The second group that was tortured within their stretch zone, just a mild amount, they found that those mice were super motivated to run the maze. They had learned a lot from their torture, and they were able to run through the maze and get to the end seemingly without problems. So what this means in our lessons is that if you have a student who you're finding maybe they're grade 4 or they've been coming to lessons for a long time, and you still have to push them off the castle, you still have to it's like pulling teeth to get them to do their lesson. It might mean that you have been pushing them too hard. You're pushing them out of their stretch zone, and now they don't feel comfortable to move on. They feel like they can't, there's not an exploratory part of them, right? Or maybe if they're just kind of unmotivated, they're not really into the lessons, maybe you're not pushing them hard enough. You need to expand their zones, try to get into their stretch zone more. Okay, is there any questions on all of this so far? All good? Okay. So, having to do with neuroplasticity, you remember what I said earlier about the default mode network? Okay, and water trying to pattern our brains and get us there anyways. So that's actually, the layman's term for that is called drifting. All right, and what they're finding is that learning, especially learning how to swim, is equal parts focused and defocused attention. The default mode network is what's active unless we are directly paying attention to something. So remember, when we're around water, our brain is naturally already trying to get to this place of drift. Right? And they're finding that drift devours a disproportionate amount of glucose and oxygen in the brain, meaning that our brain is more active actually when it is drifting than at any other point. It's in constant chatter with the hippocampus. That's the area associated with neuroplasticity. That's where neuroplasticity happens in the brain. That's where memories happen. That's where learning happens. Drift allows our brain to take all of these experiences and consolidate them into recognizable patterns and predictable outcomes. So what this means in our lessons is that we have to give our students time to drift. When we're focusing on, okay, let's say they're a grade 8, right? What are they working on? Adding their arms to freestyle and backstroke. So yes, we have to focus on those things, but we don't have to just focus on them. We need to give them defocused time to take that in, to actually understand what it is they're learning. So what does drifting look like in our lessons? A lot of the time, I'll just tell them, hey, swim over there any way you want. And if they choose to doggy paddle, I said any way they want, that is what goes.
I say the same thing, but no doggy paddle.
Yeah, so they can kind of qualify it, but true drifting would be any way they want, right? Another thing that this looks like is asking them, hey, what do you want to do today? What are you looking forward to in the pool today? They're almost always going to choose something that's easy for them, something that's in their comfort zone, right? And it's during that time that you're just going to let them drift. So you kind of hit two birds with one stone. They're fun, free time, something they want to do, and you're letting them drift. Their repetition, we also want to give them repetitions that have no expectations attached. So a lot of times at the end of my pre-comp lesson or like in the middle, I'll do, hey, let's just swim down to the block. I'll jump off and swim however you want, or swim the freestyle all the way back to mom and dad or whatever. And they almost always, the stinky little turds, they almost always swim better on that one than any of the other ones. And I'm like, ah! And it has less to do with the fact that I just spent 30 minutes working on that, and more to do with the fact that they're in drift. Their brain is actually finally now calculating all of the things that it's been working on and putting them together. A lot of times, this also looks like doing a lot, like an easy thing for them in between the hard things. So like I have a grade 4 student whose rollovers, he still is like, I'm still kind of stressed out about them. He can do them very, very well, but he's not totally in his comfort zone with those yet. And so when we work on the rollovers, we'll do, one rollover swim, and then he'll get to do like 4 easy castle swims. And then we do another rollover swim, and then 4 easy castle swims. And what's going on is he does that hard rollover swim, and during that time where his brain gets to relax and not even think about what he's doing on those easy castle swims, it's consolidating the information from that rollover swim and going, you know what, you tried the roll, it worked, it wasn't that bad. The students that I've started doing this drift with, another good one is noticing the way that they like to swim. Well, a lot of us have like vertical swimmers. That's just the way some people like to swim, right? It's a hard way to swim, but it's swimming. It is still swimming. So notice the way they like to swim. I'll put a wetsuit and 2, 3, 4 armpit rings on them and just let them like go around the pool the way that they see fit. Give them the tools that they need to swim the way they want to swim. And the kids that I've done this with, I feel like they just teach themselves how to swim. Like, I'm like, did I even teach you anything? Because we go back to their lesson, after that, or a few days later, or a few weeks later, and I'm like, all of a sudden they can swim, and I'm like, I feel like I didn't do anything. They kind of like run themselves through the lesson, So, with babies, this is my little baby Thea. She's 6 months old. With babies, drifting looks like splashing the water around, kind of letting them see it, like pouring the water. Usually it's a lot of watching the water for babies, or like blowing bubbles out your mouth and letting them see that. So remember, the water and our brains and our bodies are trying to get us to this meditative state. So let your kids meditate while they're there. Let them reach that moment. Any questions on this part? Cool, thank you. We're moving on to.
One question.
Oh yeah.
How do you reconcile spending time doing nothing when we have 15 minutes with these kids?
So that's where extra time comes into play a lot. There's some of my kids who I got to spend like 2 hours in the water with, just because everybody else after them no-showed. But ultimately, I communicate with parents. I go, hey, it doesn't look like we're doing a lot right now, but this is called drift, and what their brain is doing is it's actually way more active now than during the time we spent. So I just communicate with parents. I say, like, I do this a lot. I know it looks like we're doing nothing, but this is where their brain is actually processing everything that's going on. And another that's a really good point to bring up, because if we don't give them time to drift in our lessons, because we're trying to just get through every single thing, yes, we have to get through our lesson plan, but if we don't give them that time to drift, it's going to take so much longer for that information to settle down in the brain, right? So a lot of it's communication with parents, being like, I know it doesn't look like we're doing much, but it's actually helping them to learn.
I think it's funny how, right now we're learning kind of a lot of technical terms, but I know Jenny has brought it up as far as playtime. We teach them to play. I like to call it exploratory time. Especially when communicating with parents. Going back to Olivia's question, I have a couple really young kids who I was trying to get them to do the roles, but they just want to explore, and so I switched my lesson style to providing them the tools, and my only expectation is for her to just pop her head up to try to breathe, because nothing else is working. But going back to the drifting, she's teaching herself, you know, and so it's playtime, it's safe playtime, and that's what I had to tell the parents, that I'm not structuring it anymore, because she was fighting the structure, but I want to teach her to swim, and now she's swimming, right? So it's not the way we typically think it looks like to swim, but she's doing it, you know, and so I think it's really cool that now you're putting like technical science.
Yeah, it's a lot of things that we kind of just naturally do, you know, as you learn how to teach and all that, a lot of things we naturally do, but now we actually have the science behind it, okay? David, do you mind if I take your question at the end?
Sorry.
Oh, okay, cool. All right, so we know what happens to the body, we know what happens to our brain. So ultimately, but like to me, those two questions still didn't answer. I was like, but like, why? Why do we swim? Why does everybody on the planet have to, like, why do we have to swim? Ultimately, I just came across this quote by D.H. Lawrence. He goes, water is H2O, right? We all know that, H2O. It's 2 parts hydrogen, 1 part oxygen. But there's also a third thing that makes it water, and nobody knows what the heck it is. Okay? So we're all just swimming around trying to, you know, it makes us all feel so good, but it fulfills this part of us that we're not really sure like what it is, and it's almost every human being across the planet. And in all my reading, I came across this one quote that kind of succinctly and clearly put it. This is the closest answer I've found to that question, is to find rhythm in the water is to discover a new way of being in the world. One of the ways I found to describe that I find the easiest way to describe my life is just through various encounters with various bodies of water, right? I'm just hopping around. Well, first I was a little zygote in the womb, and then I've been hopping around, and I've had the privilege of knowing many, many swimming pools, lakes, rivers, oceans, ever since then. And when you look around at just the effects and how much water is used in our daily society, it starts to paint this huge picture of everybody needs water. Everybody feels connected to the water. I mean, the #1 reason that people cite buying a boat is because it gives them freedom. You know, the highest level of spear gun ownership per capita is in Ohio State. People have this sense that if they have the water, if they have access to the water, they have a good life. You know, some of the happiest memories of myself, you know, when we talk about like water is a very soulful experience, and those things are hard to scientifically calculate and quantify. A lot of it is just, when you hear it when people talk about the water, or they talk about their experiences with water. Some of my happiest memories have been in the water, playing with my siblings, my dad like yeeting me across the pool as far as he could when I was a kid, standing up on my first wave, surfing, like free diving, like I'm underwater free diving, and I might as well, like, I'm only 30, 60 feet below the surface, but I might as well be on an entire other planet. Like, nothing else exists. And there's a lot of Olympic swimmers and swim racers people who compete swimming, who say they really like that aspect of the water. They're like, yes, I'm swimming against other people, but I'm kind of not. It's just me versus the clock. Nobody else exists. Like when you're on the match, the pitch for soccer or whatever, like there's other people and you fight against them, but in swimming, you're just racing the clock. It's just you. A lot of times, like I mentioned earlier, I work with 3 different organizations. Those organizations, especially with veterans who suffer from PTSD, those organizations that use water as a transformative medium have effects that last 4 times as long as any other program that doesn't utilize water as its program. I think that it kind of in and of itself speaks for itself. So ultimately, what is water? Remember how I said I was going to spit out a lot of facts at you and you just have to accept them? If there's magic on this planet, it is contained in water. That is my fact. So, in closing, ultimately I want to leave you with this story. It was performed, I think, in like 2005 at a commencement speech by Dr. David Foster Wallace. This little anecdote, it goes, so there's 2 young fish, and they're swimming along in the ocean, and an older fish comes up and passes by them. And upon passing, he goes, "Morning, boys, how's the water?" And the 2 young fish kind of like look at each other, and then they like keep swimming along. Until after a couple of minutes, one of the fish looks over at the other and he goes, "What the hell is water?" And I love this story for like, especially for us, because we're at swim school. Obviously, we really connect with like fish and water and all that. But ultimately, what this story is about is being aware of what is real and what is essential, right? The things that are so real and so essential that they're hidden right there in plain sight. You know, a fish does not really notice it's swimming through water. When I'm teaching my freediving classes and I explain the composition of air to kids, they go, "Wait, air? I'm like breathing air? There's air right here?" You know, it's this thing that is right there in front of us, and we forget it all the time. And I think it's easy for us to see that as teachers, because most of us, we learned how to swim so long ago, before we were even online, like making memories. It's just water's just part of us. It's this new way that we've learned how to be in the world, and we forget how special that is sometimes. And for me, at least, it's always pertinent, it's always tangible, because I feel in part because I'm doing all of these different water sports, and a lot of times things are really uncomfortable, and I go, darn, like, gosh, if I had like just learned how to swim like 2 years ago, I wouldn't be able to do that. Like, this would suck. I wouldn't be able to get to where I am now. Those things, we have to remember, like, this is water. This is their first times. We have to learn to lead with our love of the water, with all of the great things that we know to be true about water, and show them, look at this. This is great. Every swim teacher thinks it's the greatest thing ever, right? We have to understand this is their first times. This is their introduction to it. We have to help them get to a level of comfort. Because not everybody will become a swimmer, but every single person has a swim story to tell. And collectively, we're all just pool hopping and chasing waves and immersing ourselves in oases over and over, trying to find that third thing that makes us water. Thank you. Any other questions or comments?
That was awesome.
That was a lot of information. If you're interested in this, or like Liz, if you wanted to be able to tell your husband more, the book, like a lot of this, like I said, is compiled from a lot of different stuff. If you wanted to read one book that kind of has touches on every little thing, like I said, I couldn't get to, the book Blue Mind by Wallace J. Nichols is the one that I could recommend. Blue Mind.
Thank you, Regan.
And they're screaming and crying and they're pushing because parents just, so we want them to learn how to swim as fast as they can, right? If it's unlikely, even if that student performs it in their lesson with us, it's unlikely they're going to have that information to perform outside of the lesson, because all they're doing is figuring out how to make the torture stop.
Oh, I was gonna comment earlier. You said, torture and the mice. I jokingly amongst our staff, like when we're in the water and the kids are crying, I'm like, "You're torturing kids." I know, and I hold it. I know I'm torturing you. So it's funny. It's funny because I do think about it as I do think about it as torture. I see the panic. I see their struggle. And I really like it.
You know what? You're not torturing them, but their perception, and that's what counts as their perception, right?
That's a good point. Their perception of it, which ultimately they're going through it. So yes, it is.
It's everybody's perception of everything. You hurt people's feelings without realizing it, but it does damage because that's what they thought. Yes, that was so good.
Into it.